Protest. Guilt by association. The pandemic tore at the American mask, revealing to many the injustice and brutal inequality it concealed. Police violence set fire to the mask, causing many Americans to take to the streets. While most protesters are peaceful, even in the face of armed assault, there have been undeniable cases of looting and destruction. For example, the Wendy's where Richard Brooks was killed was burned by protesters. The predictable response is that critics of the protest have cast the protesters as violent rioters, destroyers, and looters. This approach involves two fallacies, which I will discuss. But first, I will use an obvious rhetorical tactic myself. If I rushed to discussing how the attacks on the protesters often involve empty rhetoric and fallacies, this would appeal to most folks on the left and be rejected by many folks on the right, out of hand. So I'll use an example that is likely to appeal to folks on the right, that of the armed lockdown protesters. In Michigan, armed protesters peacefully occupied the Capitol, but some among them displayed symbols of white supremacy, such as the swastika, the Confederate flag, and nooses. These protesters were, in addition to criticizing the lockdown, making symbolic threats to minorities. In response, many on the left cast all the lockdown protesters as racists, white supremacists, and even in some cases, Nazis. Since there is video and photographic evidence showing that these symbols did exist among some of the protesters, it cannot be rationally denied that they were present. But it can be argued that the inference based on seeing some protesters displaying racist symbols is flawed, even fallacious. Since people generally do not make their reasoning clear, it often must be reconstructed. One possible line of bad reasoning is the use of a hasty generalization. A hasty generalization occurs when a person draws a conclusion about a population based on a sample that is not large enough to adequately support the conclusion. Roughly put, the sample is too small for the conclusion. To get technical in a philosophic sense, it has the following form. Premise 1. Sample S, which is too small, is taken from population P. Premise 2. In sample S, X% of the observed A's are B's. Conclusion. X% of all A's are B's in population P. This is a fallacy because the sample is too small to warrant the inference. In the case of the protesters, inferring that most lockdown protesters are racist, based on the observation that some clearly are, would commit this fallacy. It does not follow that they are not racist. The conclusion of the fallacy need not be false. At this point, it is likely that someone is thinking that even if most lockdown protesters are not open racist, they associate with them, thus warranting the inference that they are also guilty. This leads us to the second fallacy, that of guilt by association. The guilt by association fallacy has numerous variants, but the version in play here occurs when it is inferred that a group or individual has certain bad qualities because of their association with groups or individuals who have those bad qualities. Roughly put, the idea is that someone is bad because they are associated with someone who is bad. Getting philosophical and technical, the form of the fallacy would be this. Premise 1. Group or person A is associated with group or person B. Premise 2. Group or person B has bad qualities, P, Q, R, etc. Conclusion. Group A has bad qualities, P, Q, and R. And these qualities need not be 3, they could be more or less. So what's the mistake being made here? Why is this bad logic? Well, the error being made is that the only evidence offered is the association between the two. What is wanting, what is lacking, is an adequate connection between the two to show that the inference, the reasoning is justified. In the lockdown protester example, the general lockdown protesters were associated with protesters displaying racist symbols. But this is not enough to warrant the conclusion that they are racist. More is needed than mere guilt by association. The more is, as one would imagine, a matter of considerable debate. Those who loathe the lockdown protesters will tend to accept relatively small evidence as supporting their biased view. Those who love the lockdown protesters might be blind even to the strongest evidence. But whatever standards are used to judge association, they must be applied consistently, whether one loathes or loves the group or person. Now back to those who are protesting police violence. So the question here is, are these protesters violent looters? So as noted above, people associated with protesting police violence have engaged in destruction of property and looting. But the same standards applied to the lockdown protesters need to be applied to these protesters. To infer that because some protesters have been observed to be violent and destructive, that therefore most, or all, are violent and destructive, would be to commit that fallacy of hasty generalization. Naturally, if there is evidence showing that most, or all, lockdown protesters are racist, or evidence showing that most, or all, police violence protesters are ironically violent, then the fallacy would not be committed. To infer that those protesting police violence are violent because some associated with the protest are violent would be to commit the guilt by association fallacy, just as the fallacy would be committed if one inferred that the lockdown protesters are racist because they are associated with some racist. Obviously, if there is good evidence that those protesting police violence are generally violent, or that lockdown protesters are generally racist, then the fallacy would not be committed. But of course, we have to be consistent in groups that we loathe and groups that we love, and of course also groups that we are indifferent to.